One of the more difficult elements to build inside of any 3D graphics application is a UV map. In this video, we're going to talk about what a UV map is and how it functions and operates inside of our three-dimensional universe. As you can see on my screen here, I've modeled a very simple little dumpster, nothing too fancy. But if you look very carefully at the image map, the texture that I've placed on this dumpster, you can see that I have some very specific texture information in very specific areas. Now, because of the shape of this object, I can't really use our traditional projection types like planar or solid or even spherical to apply this texture information to this object. So I need something a little bit more advanced. Thus enter UV maps. UV maps allow us to go in and place very specific texture information, so photographs, images, on very specific parts of our model. So if you look very carefully here, I have some wonderful little logos, a little Patless logo on the front of my dumpster. I have some warning signs here, and then each side of my dumpster is completely unique from the rest, all the way down to including the wheels down over here at the bottom. Now, I wouldn't be able to generate this type of detail and this type of accuracy on the texture side without using a UV map. So let's jump in and see what a UV map is. So I'm inside my model tab. I want to jump over to my UV tab and let's begin to look at what a UV map is. So inside the UV tab, our workspace is going to be divided up into two areas. This part over here is technically our UV grid. We'll get back to this in a minute. This is where all our UV map information is going to reside. And then we have a standard 3D viewport over here. Before we jump into anything else, let's remind everyone that inside of each one of these tabs, the tools are going to change depending on which workflow we're in. Right now, we're in the UV workflow, so we're getting all of the UV tools. This part of our UV window is really important. If I zoom out a little bit, you can see that this area is comprised of a nice little grid. Now, this is a special grid, and if you look carefully at the labels for the axes, you can see one's called U and one's called V. This workspace is special. It's only being used for the texturing process. Now, we want to make sure that all of our UV islands are placed in what's called the Positive UV Quadrant. Now, think back to like 10th grade geometry when we were graphing plots or when we were graphing points on a graph. Okay, we have a negative space over here, then we have negative, negative, negative. Well, this upper right-hand quadrant is the only location inside of this grid where both the U and the V information is going to be positive values. So this is a really important of our UV grid, and it's our goal to get all of our islands for our UV map stored inside the Positive UV Quadrant. Now, what is a UV island? Let's check it out. So I'm going to switch over to polygonal mode, and I'm going to double-click on some of these objects. So each one of these little unique white shapes inside of this area is classified and called a UV island. Now, a UV island is nothing more than a 2D representation of our 3D polygons. Notice that I have this UV island selected up here in my map, and check it out. Down in my 3D viewport, its corresponding 3D polygons are also selected. So these objects up in here are nothing more than a 2D representation of their 3D polygons over here. Now, the concept that we're trying to work with here in UV map or when we're generating a UV map, is that we need to take this really super unique shape and make a 2D representation of this 3D shape. Okay, so one of the things that I often try to imagine in my head, that this is like a Christmas present or a birthday present. Well, we have a birthday present over here that is already wrapped. And what we need to do is that we need to take the wrapping paper off this present and lay it flat like we have over here on the ground. So this is the wrapping paper, and this is the present with the wrapping paper on. So we're trying to create a 2D version of our 3D object over here. Now, there's a couple goals that we need to strive for when generating UV maps. First and foremost, proportion. It's important that all of our UV islands match the proportional scale of their 3D counterparts. If they're not, we're going to get really weird distortions and warps, and the texture is not going to be placed accurately and correctly on the 3D model. So this is important. We also want to make sure that all the items that we have on our scene are placed inside of a series of UV maps. Now, this object here is going to be used for a game engine, so a real-time engine. That's why I've taken great pains at packing all of our UV islands into one UV map. If this was going to be an object that I was going to use for a feature film pipeline or maybe even for television, I would probably split this up into a number of UV maps. But for me, this is going to work pretty well. So being able to have all of our UV maps in one place in this positive UV space is really important, and it's also critical that each one of these UV islands matches the proportion and scale. Now, there's a lot of tools that we have at our disposal that are going to help us generate all these UV islands, most of which I'll discuss in later videos, but I just wanted to kind of outline the specifics on what a UV map is and how we can use it. After we use these wonderful set of awesome Modo UV tools to unwrap our model and generate all of our UV islands, it's going to allow us to send this UV map, so all of these little squares and such, over into Photoshop or some other image editor and begin to paint on our textures. Now, if we wanted to, we could absolutely use the built-in painting engine inside of Modo to paint all of our unique texture information on this model. Either workflow works perfectly. You're going to see me demoing both of these throughout the next series of videos. So once we have all of our UV maps, we're ready to start the texturing process. Up until now, we've just been modeling our dumpster, but now we're really setting up the foundation, the framework for the entire texturing pipeline. We need to make sure that all of our UV maps, every single one of these, are correct and accurate and in the correct scale and proportion before we start texturing anything in Photoshop. This is the last step of the process, and we need to make sure that everything is perfect before we start. If they're not perfect, then we're going to have to come back here, tweak some things, and then have to basically almost redo most of our texturing over in Photoshop or here in Modo. So it's important that we get it right the first time before we send out this texture information. I have some other videos on this website that outlines the transition between Modo and Photoshop that will take all of our UV information here in Modo and get it over into Photoshop. Look for that video on this site. I believe it's called Exporting UV Maps for Modo. So this is what UV Maps is all about. We're creating a 2D version of our 3D object. Now, this is an art form. Generating all these UV islands can be a challenge, and it definitely requires a nice, healthy degree of patience. But once we have all this stuff, we don't have to generate it again, and we're able to make pretty awesome photorealistic textures for our models. So that's what a UV map is.